Picture this. You're standing in a dusty town square, watching a man's life being sold to the highest bidder, and you've got one choice that'll change everything forever. That's exactly what happened to Cordelia Blackthorne on a scorching August morning in Deadwood Creek, Dakota Territory, 1873. She had every reason to turn away, to protect her family's fortune and reputation. Instead, she did something that would shock the entire territory and ignite a love story so powerful it would defy every law, tradition, and expectation of the Wild West. But here's what nobody expected. When she outbid every cruel rancher and heartless trader with her last golden coins, the warrior didn't just thank her. He looked into her eyes and spoke words in broken English that would haunt her dreams and change her destiny. "My soul, now yours, forever." What Cordelia thought was an act of mercy became something far more dangerous, far more beautiful, and far more forbidden than she could ever imagine. Because what started as one woman's desperate attempt to save a life became a tale of two worlds colliding, two hearts defying impossible odds, and two souls discovering that sometimes the greatest rebellion isn't against laws or society. It's against your own heart trying to tell you that love like this can't possibly exist. But in the untamed wilderness of the Dakota Territory, where justice was written with gunpowder and mercy was rarer than gold, Cordelia Blackthorne was about to learn that some bonds can't be broken by chains, some love can't be bought with money, and some promises echo through eternity. What she didn't know as she raised that final bid was that this warrior carried secrets that could destroy her family, start a war between settlers and tribes, and force her to choose between everything she'd ever known and a love that burned brighter than the Dakota sun. This wasn't just about buying a man's freedom. This was about two souls finding each other across an impossible divide. About a woman who would risk everything for justice, and about a warrior who would discover that sometimes the strongest chains aren't made of iron, but of love itself. This is that story, raw, untamed, and absolutely true to the spirit of the American frontier, where ordinary people did extraordinary things for love. The morning heat was already oppressive at 9 o'clock, and Cordelia Blackthorne could feel the sweat gathering beneath her proper blue dress as she made her way through the dusty streets of Deadwood Creek. The town was buzzing with an energy that made her skin crawl. Auction day always brought out the worst in people, and today's merchandise had the whole territory talking in hushed, ugly whispers. She shouldn't have come. Her father, Thaddeus Blackthorne, had made that crystal clear at breakfast. "No daughter of mine has any business witnessing such spectacles," he'd thundered, his silver mustache bristling with indignation. "The Blackthorne name stands for dignity and propriety, not whatever morbid curiosity has possessed you." But Cordelia had inherited more than just her father's steel gray eyes and stubborn chin. She'd inherited his iron will too, though she'd learned to wrap it in silk gloves and sweet smiles. At 23, she was considered an old maid by Deadwood Creek standards, having turned down 3 marriage proposals from suitable men who saw her father's cattle empire more than they saw her. Truth was, she preferred it that way. Marriage meant submission, and submission had never sat well with a woman who could outshoot most men and had been running the ranch's books since she was 16. The crowd was already thick around the makeshift auction platform when she arrived. Rough-hewn men in dusty clothes and weathered hats pressed forward, their eyes gleaming with the kind of hunger that made Cordelia's stomach turn. She recognized most of them: cattle ranchers, mine foremen, saloon owners, all looking to buy themselves some cheap labor with no questions asked and no wages owed. "Step right up, gentlemen," hollered Buck Morrison, the territory's self-appointed auctioneer, his voice cutting through the morning air like a rusty blade. "We got ourselves a fine specimen today, captured fair and square during last month's raid on the Spotted Horse Village. Strong as an ox, young enough to give you years of work, and already broken in nice and proper." Cordelia's jaw clenched. She knew about the raid. Everyone did. A group of vigilantes had attacked a peaceful Lakota camp, claiming they were seeking justice for some missing cattle. What they'd really been seeking was an excuse to capture Indians they could sell as indentured servants, a legal fiction that made slavery palatable to folks who liked to think of themselves as civilized. The crowd parted as 2 men dragged their captive forward, and Cordelia felt her breath catch in her throat. He was tall, probably 6'2", with broad shoulders and lean muscle that spoke of a life lived outdoors. His dark hair hung in two long braids and his bronze skin bore the evidence of rough treatment. Bruises along his ribs, a cut above his left eye, rope burns around his wrists. But it was his eyes that stopped her cold. They burned with a defiance that no amount of chains could break. Even shackled, even surrounded by men who saw him as nothing more than an animal to be sold, he held his head high and met every gaze with the kind of quiet dignity that made some of the crowd shift uncomfortably. This wasn't a broken man. This was a warrior who'd simply been temporarily detained. "Now don't let his looks fool you," Morrison continued, clearly uncomfortable under that steady stare. "He's been real cooperative-like since we explained the situation to him. Ain't that right, Chief?" The warrior said nothing, just continued to scan the crowd with those dark, assessing eyes. When his gaze found Cordelia's, she felt something electric pass between them. Not attraction exactly, but recognition. Like he was seeing something in her that even she didn't know was there. "What's the bidding start at?" called out Jonas Grimsby, a mean-spirited rancher known for working his men half to death. Cordelia had heard the stories about his last indentured servant, a freed slave who'd supposedly run off in the night, though folks whispered he'd been found floating in Miller's Creek with his skull caved in. "We'll start the bidding at $50, Morrison announced. "And gentlemen, let me remind you, this here's a legal and proper transaction. Bill of sale includes a 7-year indenture contract, renewable at your discretion." 7 years. Cordelia's hands clenched into fists inside her kid gloves. 7 years of slavery disguised as employment, with no wages, no rights, and no hope of escape. And renewable at the owner's discretion meant it could easily become a life sentence. $50, Grimsby shouted immediately. 60, countered Pete Hawkins, another rancher with a reputation for brutality. 75, called out someone from the back. The bidding continued to climb, and with each raised bid, Cordelia felt her anger growing hotter. These men weren't just buying a person. They were buying the right to destroy him slowly, to break his spirit one day at a time, until nothing remained of the proud warrior she saw before her. But what could she do? She was one woman against a crowd of men who'd made their choice about what was right and what was profitable. Her father's voice echoed in her head. The Blackthorn name stands for dignity and propriety. Getting involved in something like this would be neither dignified nor proper. The bidding had reached $125 when she noticed the warrior looking directly at her again. This time, there was something different in his expression. Not a plea exactly, but a question. Like he was asking if she was going to be just another face in the crowd, or if she was going to be something more. 130, Grimsby yelled, sweat beading on his forehead. The man was determined to win, and Cordelia knew why. He needed workers for his new mine operation, and indentured servants were cheaper than hired hands. That's when she made her decision. Later, she'd tell herself it was about justice, about doing what was right. But in that moment, with those dark eyes holding her steady as a rock, she knew it was about something far more dangerous than justice. It was about a recognition that went bone deep, soul deep, a certainty that walking away from this moment would haunt her for the rest of her life. $200, she called out clearly, her voice cutting through the summer air like a church bell. The crowd went dead silent. Every head turned to stare at her, mouths agape. Cordelia Blackthorn, the untouchable daughter of the territory's most powerful rancher, had just entered a bidding war for a Lakota warrior. And she wasn't done yet. But what happened next would shake the foundations of everything she thought she knew about herself, about justice, and about the kind of love that could bloom in the most impossible circumstances. Because sometimes the most radical thing a person can do isn't to follow the rules. It's to break them completely and see what grows in the rubble. The silence stretched for what felt like eternity, thick as molasses and twice as suffocating. Every eye in that dusty town square was fixed on Cordelia, and she could practically hear the wheels turning in their heads as they tried to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. The untouchable Blackthorn princess had just bid $200, more money than most of these men saw in 6 months, on a Lakota warrior. Buck Morrison cleared his throat nervously, his auctioneer's confidence suddenly shaky. Did I hear that right, Miss Blackthorne? $200? You heard correctly, Cordelia replied, keeping her voice steady despite the way her heart was hammering against her ribs. She could feel disapproving stares boring into her from every direction, but she kept her chin high and her gaze fixed on the auctioneer. There was no backing down now. Jonas Grimsby's face had gone an alarming shade of purple. Now hold on just a goddamn minute, he sputtered, spittle flying from his lips. What's a lady want with... He gestured wildly at the warrior, apparently unable to find words that were printable in mixed company. I fail to see how my intentions are any of your concern, Mr. Grimsby, Cordelia said coolly. This is an auction, is it not? The highest bidder wins, regardless of their reasons. But you're a woman, Pete Hawkins protested from somewhere in the crowd. You can't just... Can't what? Cordelia's voice cut through his objection like a blade through butter. Can't spend my own inheritance? Can't make my own decisions? I wasn't aware that Dakota Territory had passed laws restricting women's property rights. She paused, letting her words sink in. Unless, of course, you gentlemen would prefer to explain to my father why his daughter was denied the right to participate in a legal business transaction. The mention of Thaddeus Blackthorne had its intended effect. Her father might disapprove of her presence here, but he was also the most powerful man in 3 counties, with enough influence to make life very difficult for anyone who crossed his family. The crowd shifted uneasily, caught between their outrage and their self-preservation instincts. Morrison looked around desperately, clearly hoping someone else would take charge of the situation. When no one stepped forward, he turned back to the crowd with forced enthusiasm. Well then, do I hear 225? 225, Grimsby shouted immediately, his face still that dangerous shade of purple. Cordelia didn't hesitate. 250. A collective gasp went up from the crowd. $250 was more than many families made in a year. It was insane money for what these people saw as a piece of property, and everyone knew it. But Cordelia could see something they couldn't, or wouldn't. While they looked at the chained warrior and saw livestock to be broken and worked to death, she saw a human being whose dignity remained intact despite his circumstances. She saw intelligence in those dark eyes and a strength that ran deeper than muscle and bone. And most dangerously of all, she saw something in the way he looked at her that made her feel truly seen for the first time in her privileged but lonely life. God damn it, Grimsby exploded. 300! The crowd buzzed with shocked murmurs. $300 was getting into serious money territory, the kind of sum that made even wealthy men think twice. Cordelia felt a flutter of panic in her stomach. She'd brought $400 with her today, her inheritance from her grandmother, carefully saved over the years. But bidding that high would leave her with almost nothing, and she still had no real plan for what she'd do with a Lakota warrior once she owned him. Owned him. The thought made her sick. No one should own another human being, regardless of what the law said about indentured servitude. But if she didn't win this auction, Grimsby would, and she knew with cold certainty that the warrior would be dead within a year, worked to death in Grimsby's copper mine, or killed while attempting to escape. 325, she called out, her voice betraying none of her inner turmoil. Grimsby's eyes narrowed. He was sweating heavily now, and Cordelia could see him calculating in his head, trying to figure out how high he could go. She held her breath, hoping his greed wouldn't outweigh his common sense. 350, he said finally, but there was less conviction in his voice now. Cordelia's mouth went dry. She had $50 left to bid with, enough for one more raise, but that was it. If Grimsby matched her next bid, she'd have no choice but to watch the warrior be sold to a man who would destroy him piece by piece. But as she opened her mouth to make her final bid, something unexpected happened. The warrior himself spoke for the first time since being dragged onto the platform. "Wait," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent square. His English was accented but clear, and there was something in his tone that commanded attention. "I have words." Morrison looked flustered. "Now hold on there, Chief. This ain't the time for—" "I speak," the warrior repeated firmly, and something in his bearing made even the auctioneer step back. Chains or no chains, this man radiated an authority that was impossible to ignore. He turned his gaze to Cordelia, and she felt that electric connection again, stronger this time. When he spoke, his words seemed to be meant for her alone, even though everyone could hear them. "White woman," he said slowly, each word carefully chosen. "You bid for me, but do you know what you buy?" The crowd held its collective breath, fascinated despite themselves. This was unprecedented. The merchandise was actually talking back, engaging with potential buyers like he had some say in the matter. Cordelia found herself stepping forward, drawn by something she couldn't name. "I know I'm buying a human being who deserves better than to be sold like cattle," she said clearly, not caring who heard her. Something shifted in the warrior's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or respect. "My name is Mato Najin," he said, "in your tongue, Standing Bear. I am son of Chief Iron Cloud, grandson of warriors who fought alongside Crazy Horse. My blood is not slave blood." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some men shuffled their feet uncomfortably, while others muttered angrily about uppity savages who didn't know their place. But Cordelia heard something else in his words. A challenge, a test. He was asking if she truly understood what she was doing, if she was prepared for the consequences of what looked like a simple business transaction, but was actually something much more complex. "375, she said loudly, her gaze never leaving his face. Standing Bear, she couldn't think of him as anything else now that she knew his real name, nodded once, slowly. There was approval in his eyes and something else that made her heart skip a beat. Gratitude maybe, or recognition of her courage. Whatever it was, it made her feel like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to jump into something that would change her life forever. Grimsby's face was now approaching a dangerous shade of red that suggested he might be on the verge of apoplexy. 400, he roared, his voice cracking with fury and desperation. Cordelia's heart sank. That was it. She was out of money. She'd lost, and Standing Bear would spend whatever remained of his life in Grimsby's brutal hands. But then something miraculous happened. A new voice called out from the crowd, cultured, authoritative, and completely unexpected. $500. Every head turned to see who had spoken, and Cordelia felt her knees go weak with shock. Standing at the edge of the crowd, immaculate in his black suit and silver-tipped walking cane, was her father. Thaddeus Blackthorne had come to the auction after all, and judging by the steel in his gray eyes and the set of his jaw, he was not happy about what he'd found there. But whether he was bidding to save his daughter from embarrassment or for some other reason entirely remained to be seen. Because one thing was certain, when Thaddeus Blackthorne entered the game, all the rules changed. In Standing Bear, his eyes had never left Cordelia's face, even as her father's shocking bid sent shockwaves through the crowd. Whatever was happening here, whatever forces were converging on this dusty town square, the warrior seemed to understand that his fate was tied to hers in ways that went far beyond money or ownership. The question was, did she understand it too? The silence that followed Thaddeus Blackthorne's bid was different from the stunned quiet that had greeted Cordelia's earlier entry into the auction. This was the kind of silence that fell over a room when a mountain lion padded into a gathering of rabbits, electric with danger and the promise of violence to come. Cordelia's father cut through the crowd like Moses parting the Red Sea, men stepping aside with their hats in their hands and their eyes downcast. At 62, Thaddeus Blackthorne was still an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with steel gray hair and the kind of presence that made strong men reconsider their life choices. He'd built his cattle empire from nothing, fighting off claim jumpers, rustlers, and hostile tribes with equal determination. In Deadwood Creek, his word was law, and his displeasure could ruin a man faster than a bad winter. "Father," Cordelia breathed as he approached, her voice barely above a whisper. She couldn't read his expression. His face was set in the granite mask he wore when conducting serious business. But there was something burning in his gray eyes that she'd never seen before. "Cordelia," he said curtly, not breaking stride as he passed her, and positioned himself directly in front of the auction platform. "We'll discuss your presence here later." Buck Morrison was practically vibrating with nervous energy, clearly torn between his auctioneer duties and his very reasonable fear of crossing the most powerful man in 3 counties. "Mr. Blackthorn, sir," he stammered. Uh, did I hear $500? "You did," Thaddeus replied, his voice carrying the same authority he used when addressing his ranch hands. "And I trust there won't be any confusion about the validity of my bid?" It wasn't really a question. Morrison nodded so vigorously his hat nearly fell off. "No, sir, no confusion at all. $500 it is." Jonas Grimsby looked like he was about to have an apoplectic fit. His face had progressed beyond purple into an alarming shade that suggested internal bleeding. "Blackthorn," he sputtered. "You can't just... This ain't right. I had the winning bid." Thaddeus turned to face him with the slow, deliberate movement of a man who'd never had to hurry for anything in his life. "Mr. Grimsby," he said pleasantly, "if you'd like to bid $600, you're welcome to do so. Otherwise, I suggest you step back and allow the auction to proceed." $600. The amount hung in the air like a challenge. Grimsby opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water, clearly wanting to continue the bidding war, but knowing he was outgunned. Even if he had that kind of money, which was doubtful, going toe-to-toe with Thaddeus Blackthorn was a losing proposition in every sense of the word. "Anyone else?" Morrison called out, though his voice cracked on the words. "Going once for $500. Going twice." Cordelia found herself looking at Standing Bear again, trying to read his expression. The warrior's gaze had shifted from her to her father, and there was something calculating in his dark eyes, as if he was reassessing the entire situation based on this new player entering the game. Did he understand what was happening? Did he know that her father's bid might actually make his situation worse rather than better? Because Cordelia was beginning to understand something that chilled her to the bone. Her father hadn't come here to save Standing Bear from Grimsby's cruelty. He'd come to save his family's reputation from his daughter's reckless compassion. And that meant the warrior was about to trade one form of captivity for another. Perhaps one that was more refined, but no less complete. "Sold!" Morrison's gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo off every building in town. "To Mr. Thaddeus Blackthorn for $500. The crowd began to disperse, men drifting away in small groups, their voices low as they discussed what they just witnessed. Cordelia caught fragments of conversation as they passed. Speculation about Thaddeus's motivations, criticism of her unladylike behavior, and ugly predictions about what would happen to the savage now that he belonged to the Blackthorns. But Cordelia barely heard them. She was watching her father approach the platform where Standing Bear waited, still chained, still radiating that quiet dignity despite everything that had happened to him. Two men who came from completely different worlds, about to negotiate the terms of one man's enslavement to another. "Release the chains," Thaddeus ordered Morrison curtly. "I'll be taking him with me immediately." Morrison hesitated. "Sir, are you sure that's wise? I mean, he's a wild one, and without the restraints—" "Mr. Morrison," Thaddeus interrupted, his voice carrying a warning that made the auctioneer take a step back. "I've been handling dangerous animals longer than you've been alive." Whatever it was, it sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with possibilities she wasn't ready to name. The ride home to the Blackthorn Ranch was a blur of dust and jumbled thoughts. Cordelia's mind raced as the carriage bounced over the rutted roads, carrying her away from the town and toward a confrontation she wasn't prepared for. What had she been thinking, bidding on a human being at a slave auction? What had possessed her to risk her family's reputation for a man she didn't even know? But even as she asked herself these questions, she knew the answers. She'd seen something in Standing Bear's eyes that had called to something deep inside her, a recognition that went beyond words or rational thought. And now her father owned him, which meant he'd be living on their ranch, working their land, breathing the same air she breathed. The Blackthorn Ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime Dakota Territory grazing land, with a main house that rivaled anything back east for size and luxury. Thaddeus had spared no expense in creating a monument to his success, and the result was a cattle empire that employed over 100 men and dominated the local economy. Cordelia barely noticed the familiar grandeur as she hurried inside and up to her room, From her window, she could see the road that led back to town, and she found herself watching for signs of her father's return. What was he saying to Standing Bear during their ride to the ranch? What arrangements was he making for housing, for work, for the hundred small details that would determine whether her impulsive act of mercy became a blessing or a curse? It was nearly sunset when she finally heard the sound of hooves on gravel. From her window, she watched her father ride up to the main house. But Standing Bear was nowhere to be seen. Wherever he'd been taken, it wasn't to the front entrance where honored guests would be received. 20 minutes later, she heard her father's heavy footsteps on the stairs, and she knew the reckoning had come. "Cordelia!" His voice was deadly quiet as he stood in her doorway. "We need to talk." She turned from the window, squaring her shoulders for the fight she knew was coming. "Yes, father." "I believe we do." But what neither of them realized was that this conversation would set into motion events that would change not just their relationship, but the entire balance of power on the frontier. Because Standing Bear wasn't just any Lakota warrior. He was the son of a chief whose influence stretched far beyond the boundaries of any ranch or territory. And some bonds, once forged in the heat of a moment's compassion, could never be broken by words alone. Thaddeus Blackthorne closed the door behind him with the kind of careful control that spoke of barely contained fury. Cordelia had seen her father angry before, when rustlers had stolen 50 head of cattle, when politicians had tried to squeeze him for bribes, when business rivals had attempted to undercut his contracts. But she'd never seen him look at her the way he was looking at her now, as if she'd become a stranger who'd invaded his home and threatened everything he'd built. "Sit down," he said quietly, gesturing to the chair beside her writing desk. "Father, I can explain." "Sit down." Cordelia sat, her hands folded in her lap like a schoolgirl called before the headmaster. But inside, her spirit was already rebelling against the lecture she knew was coming. She was 23 years old, a grown woman with her own inheritance and her own mind. She didn't need her father's permission to follow her conscience. Thaddeus moved to the window where she'd been standing, looking out over the ranch that represented his life's work. The setting sun painted his profile in golden shadow, making him look older than his 62 years. "Do you have any idea," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "what you've done today?" "I tried to save a man's life," Cordelia replied, lifting her chin defiantly. "I tried to prevent an innocent person from being sold into slavery." Her father turned from the window, and the look in his gray eyes made her shrink back despite herself. "Innocent?" He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Cordelia, that man you were so eager to save is Mato Najian, son of Chief Ironcloud. Do you know who Ironcloud is?" A chill ran down Cordelia's spine, but she shook her head. "He's the war chief who led the raid on the Murphy settlement last spring. 15 people died in that attack, including 3 children. He's the one who's been organizing resistance against the railroad expansion, convincing other tribes to break their treaties and go back on the warpath. And his son, your innocent victim, was captured during a raid on a supply train that resulted in 4 more deaths." The words hit Cordelia like physical blows. She'd known Standing Bear was a warrior, had seen it in his bearing and his eyes, but she'd assumed he'd been captured in some skirmish or border dispute. The idea that he might have blood on his hands, that he might have killed settlers, people like her, made her stomach churn. "You don't know that he was involved in those deaths," she said weakly, but even to her own ears the protest sounded hollow. "Don't I?" Thaddeus moved closer, and Cordelia could see the veins standing out on his forehead. "What do you think warriors do during raids, Cordelia? Do you think they sit around the campfire telling stories while other men do the killing?" She wanted to argue, wanted to defend the man who'd looked at her with such dignity and recognition, but the truth was, she didn't know anything about Standing Bear beyond what she'd seen in that brief encounter. She'd acted on instinct, on emotion, on some foolish romantic notion about justice and mercy, and now her father was telling her she'd potentially brought a killer into their home. "But you still bought him," she pointed out, grasping for some way to make sense of her father's actions. "If he's so dangerous, why didn't you let Grimsby have him?" Thaddeus was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weariness that made him sound every one of his years. "Because Jonas Grimsby is a sadistic fool who would have worked him to death in his mines, And that would have started a war that would make the Murphy raid look like a church picnic. He sat down heavily in the chair across from her, suddenly looking more like a tired old man than the cattle baron who ruled half the territory. Ironclad has been looking for an excuse to unite the tribes against us. The death of his son in a white man's mind would have given him that excuse. "So you bought Standing Bear to prevent a war?" Cordelia asked, trying to understand the chess game her father had been playing while she'd been acting on pure emotion. "I bought him to buy time," Thaddeus corrected. "Time to figure out how to resolve the situation without getting everyone within 100 miles killed. Because make no mistake, Cordelia, Ironclad knows where his son is now. He knows we have him, and he's going to want him back." The implications of her father's words settled over Cordelia like a heavy blanket. Her impulsive act of mercy hadn't just risked her family's reputation. It had potentially put their lives in danger. The man she'd been so determined to save might be the spark that ignited a full-scale Indian war. But even as these thoughts raced through her mind, she couldn't shake the memory of Standing Bear's eyes. The way he'd looked at her with something that went beyond gratitude or recognition. There had been intelligence there, an honor, and a kind of nobility that she'd never seen in any of the civilized men who'd courted her over the years. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now we try to clean up the mess you've made," Thaddeus replied bluntly. "I've got him working with the horse crew for now, far enough from the main house that he can't cause immediate trouble, but visible enough that anyone watching will know he's alive and being treated decently. I've sent word to the territorial governor requesting advice on how to handle the situation legally, and I've doubled the guards on the property because we may have visitors sooner than we'd like." "Visitors?" "Ironclad's warriors. They've probably been tracking him since the capture, waiting for the right moment to attempt a rescue. Now that they know where he is, that moment may come very soon." Cordelia felt a stab of something that might have been fear or excitement. She couldn't tell which. "And if they come," her father's expression hardened, "then we'll be ready for them. I didn't build this ranch to lose it to a war party, no matter whose son they're trying to rescue." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of the situation settling between them like a third presence in the room. Outside, Cordelia could hear the normal evening sounds of the ranch, cattle lowing, men calling to each other as they finished their work, the distant sound of someone playing a harmonica by the bunkhouse. It all seemed impossibly normal, considering that somewhere out there, a war chief was probably planning to attack their home to rescue his son. "I want to see him," Cordelia said suddenly. "Absolutely not. Father, Cordelia, listen to me very carefully." Thaddeus leaned forward, his gray eyes boring into hers. "That man is not some romantic hero from one of your novels. He's a warrior who's been trained to kill since he was old enough to hold a knife. The fact that he's being held here against his will, even under relatively comfortable circumstances, makes him dangerous in ways you can't possibly understand." "But he spoke to me," Cordelia protested. "At the auction, he looked at me like he knew me somehow. There was a connection." "There was recognition," her father cut her off harshly. "The recognition of a predator identifying potential prey. He saw a wealthy white woman who might be sympathetic to his cause, and he played on your emotions accordingly. It's exactly what I would do in his position." The cruel words stung, but Cordelia couldn't entirely dismiss them. What if her father was right? What if the electric connection she'd felt with Standing Bear had been nothing more than a calculated manipulation on his part? What if she'd been nothing more than a useful fool? But even as she tried to accept this possibility, something deep inside her rebelled against it. She might be naive about many things, but she knew the difference between genuine emotion and performance. What she'd seen in Standing Bear's eyes hadn't been calculation. It had been recognition of a kindred spirit, someone who understood what it meant to be trapped by circumstances beyond their control. "I still want to see him," she said quietly. "Not alone, if that makes you feel better. But I want to know that he's all right." "He's fine," Thaddeus said curtly. "Miguel has him working with the Mustangs. Dangerous work, but it keeps him busy and gives him a chance to prove he can be trusted with some degree of freedom. If he behaves himself, he might eventually earn enough privileges to make his situation bearable. And if he doesn't behave himself," her father's expression grew cold, Then I'll do what I have to do to protect this family and everyone who depends on us. Don't mistake my desire to avoid a war for weakness, Cordelia. If that warrior becomes a threat to the people I care about, I'll put him down like a rabid dog." The casual brutality of his words made Cordelia flinch. This was a side of her father she'd always known existed, but had never been forced to confront directly. Thaddeus Blackthorne was a man who'd built an empire in hostile territory, and he hadn't done it by being gentle with his enemies. "Now," he continued, standing up and moving toward the door, "you're going to stay away from him. You're not going to seek him out, you're not going to try to talk to him, and you're sure as hell not going to do anything else that might complicate this situation further. Are we understood?" Cordelia nodded reluctantly, but inside her mind was already racing. She might have agreed to her father's restrictions, but that didn't mean she intended to follow them blindly. Standing Bear was here because of her actions, which made him her responsibility as much as her father's. And if there really was a connection between them, if the recognition she'd felt had been mutual and genuine, then she owed it to both of them to find out the truth. "Good," Thaddeus said, apparently satisfied with her compliance. "Now get some rest. Tomorrow you're going to write a letter to your Aunt Josephine in San Francisco, accepting her invitation to visit. It's time you got away from this place for a while, at least until this situation resolves itself." "You're sending me away?" Cordelia's voice rose in disbelief. "Father, I'm not a child to be shipped off when things get inconvenient." "You're my daughter," he replied firmly, "and I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe, even if that means protecting you from your own foolish impulses." He left without another word, closing the door behind him with a finality that echoed through the room. Cordelia sat alone in the gathering darkness, her mind churning with everything she'd learned and everything she still didn't understand. Standing Bear was the son of a war chief, possibly a killer, definitely dangerous. Her father was planning to send her away to keep her from complicating an already volatile situation. And somewhere out in the vast Dakota territory, Ironclad and his warriors were probably planning their next move in a chess game where the stakes were measured in blood. But none of that changed the fundamental truth that had driven her to bid on Standing Bear in the first place. He was a human being, not a piece of property to be bought and sold. And regardless of what he might have done in the past, he deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. More than that, there was still that connection she'd felt, that moment of recognition that had passed between them like electricity across a stormy sky. Her father could dismiss it as manipulation or wishful thinking, but Cordelia knew what she'd experienced, and she was determined to find out if Standing Bear had felt it too. Even if it meant defying her father and risking everything she'd ever known, she was going to find a way to see him again. Because some things were more important than safety, more valuable than reputation, and more powerful than fear. And love, if that's what this dangerous feeling growing in her chest really was, might just be the most powerful force of all. For 3 days, Cordelia watched from her bedroom window as Standing Bear worked with the horses in the distant corrals, her father's words echoing in her mind like a broken record. Predator identifying prey, calculated manipulation, rabid dog. But what she saw through her spyglass didn't match the image of a dangerous killer that her father had painted. Instead, she watched a man who moved among the half-wild mustangs with a grace that took her breath away. The horses seemed to recognize something in him that the other ranch hands lacked, a wildness that matched their own, perhaps, or an understanding that went deeper than mere training techniques. Where other men used ropes and whips and brute force, Standing Bear used patience, moving slowly and deliberately until even the most skittish animals would approach him. On the third afternoon, she watched him calm a particularly aggressive stallion that had already injured 2 cowhands. The black horse was magnificent but utterly untamable, or so everyone had thought. For over an hour, Standing Bear simply sat on the corral fence, not moving, barely even breathing, until gradually the stallion's fury subsided into curiosity. By sunset, he was feeding the horse from his hand. That night, Cordelia made her decision. Her father might forbid her from seeing Standing Bear, but this was her family's ranch too. She had every right to check on their employee. The fact that she waited until well past midnight to do so was merely a practical consideration. no sense causing unnecessary complications. The main house was silent as she crept through the hallways, her soft leather boots making no sound on the polished wooden floors. Years of sneaking out for midnight rides had taught her which floorboards creaked and which doors squeaked on their hinges. Within minutes, she was outside, breathing the cool night air and listening to the symphony of cricket song and distant cattle lowing. Miguel had mentioned that Standing Bear was staying in the old line shack near the horse pastures, a small cabin that had once housed seasonal workers but had been empty for months. It was a 20-minute walk from the main house, long enough for Cordelia to question the wisdom of her actions a dozen times. But her feet kept carrying her forward, drawn by something stronger than caution or common sense. The cabin sat in a grove of cottonwood trees, their leaves whispering secrets in the night breeze. A thin stream of smoke rose from the chimney, and lamplight flickered behind oiled paper windows. Cordelia paused at the edge of the clearing, suddenly uncertain. What was she going to say? What excuse could she possibly give for being here in the middle of the night? Before she could lose her nerve, the cabin door opened, and Standing Bear stepped outside. In the moonlight, he looked even more imposing than he had on the auction platform. Tall and lean, with the kind of controlled power that spoke of years spent surviving in hostile territory. He wore simple work clothes now instead of his traditional garb, but they couldn't disguise the inherent dignity that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a fire. "I wondered when you would come," he said quietly, his accented English carrying clearly in the still air. Cordelia stepped into the clearing, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You knew I was here?" "I know when rabbits move in the brush," he replied, and she caught the hint of amusement in his voice. "White woman who walks like she owns the earth. This is not hard to hear." Despite her nervousness, Cordelia found herself smiling. "I suppose stealth was never one of my talents." "Courage was," Standing Bear said, and the simple statement sent warmth flooding through her chest. "At the auction, you show more courage than all the men with their guns and their loud voices." They stood facing each other in the moonlight, neither moving closer, but both aware of the electric tension humming in the space between them. Cordelia had come here with a dozen questions, but now that she was actually face to face with him, words seemed inadequate. "My father told me who you are," she said finally. "About your father, about the raids." Standing Bear's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle straightening, as if he was preparing for judgment. "And now you fear me?" "I don't know," Cordelia admitted honestly. "Should I?" He studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face as if looking for something specific. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him, because when he spoke again, his voice was gentler than before. "Your people killed my mother," he said simply. "Soldiers came to our winter camp when I was 12 winters old. They said we had stolen horses, but we had no horses that were not ours. They burned our lodges, scattered our herds, and when my mother tried to protect the children—" He paused, and Cordelia saw his hands clench briefly at his sides. "She died with an infant in her arms." The words hit Cordelia like physical blows. She'd grown up hearing stories of Indian raids, of the savage attacks on innocent settlers, but she'd never considered that there might be another side to those stories. The idea that her own people, soldiers representing her government, might have committed the same kinds of atrocities they accused the Indians of was almost too painful to accept. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words feeling utterly inadequate. "I tell you this," Standing Bear continued, "not to make you feel sorrow, but to make you understand. When white soldiers kill my mother, I become warrior. When white miners poison our rivers and white hunters kill all the buffalo, I fight back. This is not evil. This is survival." "And the settlers who died?" Cordelia asked quietly. "The children my father mentioned?" Pain flashed across Standing Bear's features, quick as lightning but unmistakable. "War makes killers of good men," he said finally. "White and Indian both. I have done things that will follow me to the spirit world, but I have also tried to protect those who could not protect themselves." The honesty in his voice, the obvious struggle he was having with his own actions, told Cordelia everything she needed to know about his character. This wasn't a man who killed for pleasure or sport, This was someone who'd been forced into violence by circumstances beyond his control, just as she'd been forced into a life of privilege and restriction by her birth. "Why did you let my father buy you?" she asked. "You could have fought them, could have tried to escape." Standing Bear moved closer, and Cordelia caught the scent of wood smoke and sage that seemed to cling to his skin. "Because you bid for me first," he said simply. "Because when I looked at you, I saw something I had not seen in any white face before." "What did you see?" "Someone who knows what it is to be caged." The words hit her like a revelation. He was right. She did know what it was to be caged, trapped by expectations and social conventions, just as surely as he was trapped by chains and legal documents. The cage might be gilded, but it was still a cage. "Your father thinks I will hurt you," Standing Bear said, stepping even closer. They were only a few feet apart now, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "He thinks I am animal who tricks you with soft words." "Are you?" Cordelia asked, though she already knew the answer. Instead of responding with words, Standing Bear reached into his shirt and pulled out something that made Cordelia's breath catch. It was a small carving, no bigger than her thumb, intricately detailed despite its size. A horse in full gallop, its mane flowing behind it like water, captured in a moment of perfect freedom. "I make this while I work with your horses," he said, holding it out to her. "It reminds me of you." "Of me." Cordelia took the carving, her fingers brushing against his as she did. The contact sent electricity shooting up her arm, and she saw Standing Bear's eyes darken with something that made her pulse quicken. "Wild thing that should run free," he explained. "Beautiful, powerful, but trapped by fences made by others." Cordelia stared at the tiny horse, overwhelmed by the artistry and the thought behind it. No one had ever made anything for her before. Certainly not something this personal, this meaningful. In her world, gifts were purchased from catalogs or commissioned from artisans. The idea that someone had spent hours carving something specifically for her, thinking of her with each careful cut of the knife, was almost too much to process. "I can't accept this," she said, though her fingers closed possessively around the carving. "Why?" "Because..." She struggled to find words for something that went beyond social convention into the realm of genuine fear. "Because if I take it, it means something. And if it means something, then everything changes." Standing Bear moved closer still, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "Everything already changed," he said softly. "The moment you bid for me, the moment you chose to see man instead of savage, everything changed." He was right, and they both knew it. The careful boundaries of her life had shifted the moment she'd raised her hand in that dusty town square. There was no going back to the safe, predictable existence she'd known before. "My father wants to send me to San Francisco," she said quietly, "to keep you away from me." "Yes." Standing Bear nodded, as if he'd expected this. "He is wise man. Smart father protects daughter from dangerous warrior. But he cannot protect you from yourself." Standing Bear raised his hand slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and touched her cheek with gentle fingers. "And he cannot change what is already written in the stars." "What do you mean?" "My grandmother was medicine woman," he said, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with reverent care. "She teach me to read signs, to see patterns that others cannot see. When I look at you, I see something that was always meant to be." "That's impossible," Cordelia whispered, but she made no move to step away from his touch. "We're from different worlds. Your people and mine have been at war for generations." "Some things are stronger than war," Standing Bear replied. "Some connections go deeper than the hatred of tribes." Before Cordelia could respond, he leaned down and kissed her. It was gentle at first, almost tentative, as if he was giving her a chance to pull away. But when she didn't, when she instead stepped closer and allowed her hands to come to rest on his chest, the kiss deepened into something that felt like coming home and setting out on a dangerous journey all at the same time. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Cordelia's world had narrowed down to this moment, this man, this impossible connection that felt more real than anything she'd ever experienced. This is madness, she breathed. Yes, Standing Bear agreed, resting his forehead against hers. Beautiful, dangerous madness. A sound in the distance, the soft whinny of a horse that shouldn't have been disturbed at this hour, made both of them freeze. Standing Bear's head snapped up, his entire body going still with the alertness of a wild animal sensing danger. You must go, he said urgently, pulling away from her. Now. What is it? Riders! Coming from the east. His expression was grim as he scanned the darkness beyond the trees. Too many to be your father's men on patrol. The implication hit Cordelia like a punch to the stomach. Ironcloud's warriors had come for their war chief's son, and she was standing in the middle of what was about to become a battlefield. Come with me, she said desperately, grabbing his arm. Come back to the house. My father's men can protect you. Standing Bear shook his head. They do not come as enemies. They come for family. He gently removed her hand from his arm, but his eyes never left her face. This was always going to happen. Then I'm staying with you. No. His voice carried an authority that reminded her forcibly that he was the son of a chief, born to command. You will go back to your father's house, and you will forget this night ever happened. I can't do that. Standing Bear cupped her face in both hands, his eyes boring into hers with desperate intensity. Then remember it, he said fiercely. Remember that for one moment, two caged birds found each other in the darkness. Remember that some connections cannot be broken by distance or time or the hatred of tribes. The sound of approaching horses was getting closer now, and Cordelia knew she was out of time. But as she turned to leave, Standing Bear caught her hand one last time. Keep the horse, he said quietly, and know that wherever I go, whatever happens, part of my spirit will always belong to you. Then he was stepping back into the shadows, becoming one with the darkness as if he'd never existed at all. Cordelia clutched the carved horse to her chest and ran through the night toward her father's house, tears streaming down her face and her heart breaking with every step. Behind her, the sound of horses grew louder, and she knew that when the sun rose, Standing Bear would be gone. The question was whether he would go as a free man reunited with his people, or as the spark that ignited the war her father had been so desperate to avoid. Either way, her life would never be the same. Cordelia burst through the front door of the ranch house just as her father emerged from his study, fully dressed despite the late hour and carrying his Winchester rifle. The expression on his weathered face told her that he'd already heard what she'd been running from. The sound of approaching horses that could only mean one thing. Where the hell have you been? Thaddeus demanded, his gray eyes flashing with a mixture of fear and fury that she'd never seen before. I couldn't sleep, so I went for a walk. Don't lie to me, Cordelia. His voice was deadly quiet, the tone he used when his patience had reached its absolute limit. Not tonight, not with Ironcloud's war party riding toward my ranch. Before she could respond, Miguel burst through the door behind her, his face grim and his hand resting on his gun butt. Boss, they're here. 20 riders, maybe more, positioned along the ridge. They ain't hiding. Want us to know they're there. Thaddeus nodded curtly. Wake the men. Full alert, but nobody shoots unless I give the word. And Miguel. He paused, his jaw clenching. Make sure our guest is secure. Already done, boss. Got him locked in the root cellar with 2 men standing guard. Cordelia's heart lurched. You can't lock him up like an animal. He's done nothing wrong. He's the son of a war chief who's currently surrounding my property with armed warriors, Thaddeus snapped. Right now, he's the only thing standing between us and a massacre. The sound of a single horse approaching at a gallop made all 3 of them freeze. Cordelia moved to the window, peering through the curtains at the moonlit yard. A lone rider was approaching the house. A Lakota warrior in full ceremonial dress, his horse dancing sideways with nervous energy. That's not Ironcloud, Miguel said quietly, joining her at the window. Too young, and he's carrying a talking stick, not weapons. Messenger, Thaddeus grunted, wants to parley. They watched as the warrior rode to the center of the yard and sat motionless on his horse, waiting. He made no aggressive moves, issued no challenges, simply waited with the patience of someone who understood the gravity of the situation. I'm going out there, Thaddeus said, checking his rifle one final time. Father, no! Cordelia grabbed his arm. What if it's a trap? Then we'll deal with it. He gently removed her hand from his sleeve, and for a moment his expression softened. Cordelia, I need you to promise me something. Whatever happens out there, whatever you hear or see, you stay in this house. Do you understand me? She wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she had as much right as anyone to face the consequences of her actions. But the look in her father's eyes told her that this was not the time for rebellion. I understand, she said quietly. Thaddeus nodded and stepped out into the night, Miguel at his side. Cordelia pressed her face to the window, her heart pounding as she watched her father approach the warrior. From this distance, she couldn't hear what was being said, but she could see the tension in both men's postures as they engaged in what was clearly a formal exchange. After several minutes, the warrior wheeled his horse around and rode back toward the ridge. Thaddeus stood in the yard for a long moment, looking up at the dark shapes positioned along the high ground, before walking back to the house. Well, Cordelia demanded the moment he stepped through the door. Iron Cloud wants his son back, Thaddeus said simply. He's willing to negotiate, but only if we demonstrate good faith by releasing Madonajin immediately. So do it, Cordelia said urgently. Give him back his son and end this before it starts. Her father's laugh was bitter and without humor. You think it's that simple? You think we can just hand over a man we legally purchased and everything goes back to normal? Why can't we? Because the territorial government paid good money for information leading to the capture of Ironcloud's son, Miguel explained quietly. Because there's a bounty on his head that half the territory wants to collect. Because letting him go means admitting that the whole auction was illegal, which opens up a can of worms nobody wants to deal with. Politics, Thaddeus added grimly. Dirty, complicated politics that could get us all killed if we handle this wrong. Cordelia felt a surge of fury that threatened to overwhelm her. Standing Bear was being used as a pawn in some larger game, his life held hostage by bureaucrats and bounty hunters who saw him as nothing more than a commodity to be traded. There has to be another way, she said desperately. Maybe there is, Thaddeus replied, though he didn't sound hopeful. Ironcloud's messenger said the chief wants to speak with me directly. Dawn at the old trading post, neutral ground. You can't go, Cordelia protested. It's too dangerous. It's the only chance we have to resolve this without bloodshed. Thaddeus moved to his gun cabinet and began selecting weapons with the methodical care of a man who'd done this before. If I can convince him that we're willing to negotiate in good faith, maybe we can find a solution that doesn't end with half the territory going up in flames. And if you can't, her father's expression was grim, then we make our stand here and hope we've got enough ammunition to last until the cavalry arrives. The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation and mounting tension. Cordelia watched from her window as her father's men took positions around the ranch buildings, their faces tight with the knowledge that they were outnumbered at least 2-1. Every creak of the house, every distant sound made her heart jump. As the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the horizon, Thaddeus prepared to leave for his meeting with Ironcloud. He'd changed into his best suit, black wool with a string tie, and strapped on his gun belt with the ivory-handled Colt he'd carried through the war. If something goes wrong, he told Cordelia quietly, Miguel knows what to do. There's a fast horse saddled and ready in the back corral. If shooting starts, you get on that horse and ride for Fort Harrison as fast as you can. I'm not leaving you. You'll do what you have to do to survive, Thaddeus replied firmly. That's what blackthorns do. He kissed her forehead gently and walked out into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving Cordelia alone with her fears and the terrible certainty that everything was about to change forever. She couldn't just sit and wait. Despite her promise to her father, despite the danger, she had to do something. Standing Bear was locked in the root cellar like a criminal, and the man she was falling in love with was being treated as a bargaining chip in someone else's war. Moving quietly through the house, she made her way to the kitchen and then out the back door. The root cellar was a stone structure built into the hillside behind the main house, designed to keep food cool during the hot Dakota summers. 2 of her father's men stood guard outside, but they were facing outward, watching for threats from the ridge. Jake, she called softly to one of the guards, a young cowhand who'd worked for her family for 3 years. I need to speak with the prisoner. Jake looked uncomfortable. Miss Cordelia, your pa said nobody was to. My father also said to treat our guest with respect, she interrupted firmly. I'm simply ensuring that he has what he needs for comfort. Surely that doesn't violate your orders. The guard wavered, clearly torn between his instructions and his natural deference to the boss's daughter. Finally, he stepped aside with obvious reluctance. 5 minutes, he said quietly. And if your pa asks, I never saw you here. The root cellar was dark and cool, lit only by a single oil lamp hanging from the ceiling. Standing Bear sat on a wooden crate in the corner, his wrists bound with rope but his dignity intact. When he saw her, something flickered in his dark eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or a kind of weary acceptance. I told you to forget this night, he said quietly. I tried. Cordelia stepped closer, keeping her voice low so the guards outside wouldn't hear. Are you hurt? Only my pride. He gestured to his bound hands with a bitter smile. Your father's men were thorough in their precautions. They're frightened, Cordelia said, moving to untie the ropes. We all are. Standing Bear watched her work, his expression unreadable. You should not be here. If your father finds you. My father has gone to meet with Iron Cloud. The ropes fell away, and she rubbed his wrists where they'd been chafed raw. They're trying to negotiate your release. There will be no negotiation, Standing Bear said with quiet certainty. My father did not come here to talk. He came to take back what was stolen from him. Then why agree to a meeting? To give his warriors time to get into position? Standing Bear stood up slowly, stretching muscles that had been cramped from sitting in the same position for hours. By now they have surrounded this place completely. Your father walks into a trap. Horror washed over Cordelia as the implications of his words sank in. We have to warn him. It is too late. Standing Bear caught her hands in his expression gentle despite the grim news he was delivering. Your father is a brave man, but he does not understand how my people think. He believes this is about law and politics and territorial boundaries. For my father, this is about blood and honor and the bond between a chief and his son. Then we have to get you out of here, Cordelia said desperately. If you're not here when Ironcloud arrives, maybe... No. Standing Bear's voice was firm. Running would bring shame to my father and death to your people. This must end with honor on both sides, or it will not end at all. What do you mean? Instead of answering immediately, Standing Bear reached into his shirt and pulled out a small object that made Cordelia's breath catch. It was another carving, smaller than the horse he'd given her the night before, but no less intricate. This one showed two figures standing together, a man and a woman from different worlds, their hands clasped in defiance of everything that should have kept them apart. I made this while I waited in the darkness, he said softly, a reminder of what could have been in a different world. Cordelia took the carving with trembling fingers, her eyes filling with tears. It's beautiful. You are beautiful. Standing Bear cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had begun to spill down her cheeks. In all my life, in all the battles and raids and long winters of my people, I have never seen anything as beautiful as you standing in that dusty square, risking everything for a stranger. You're not a stranger, Cordelia whispered. You never were. No, he agreed, leaning down to rest his forehead against hers. We are bound by something deeper than names or tribes or the hatred of our fathers. But sometimes love is not enough to bridge the spaces between worlds. The sound of approaching horses, many horses, moving fast, made them both freeze. Through the small window of the root cellar, Cordelia could see riders streaming down from the ridge, their war paint and feathers clearly visible in the growing daylight. It's happening, she breathed. Standing Bear nodded grimly. My father has come to take me home. And if you don't want to go... He was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face as if memorizing every detail. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with a sorrow that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. Then I dishonor my blood, bring war to your people, and destroy any chance that our two worlds might someday find peace. He touched the carved figures one last time, then gently closed her fingers around them. Some prices are too high to pay, even for love. Outside, the sound of rifles being cocked and men shouting orders filled the air. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Cordelia knew that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine not just Standing Bear's fate, but the fate of everyone she'd ever cared about. The question was, could love really conquer all, or were some divides simply too wide to cross? The gunshots that Cordelia expected never came. Instead, as Ironclad's warriors surrounded the ranch buildings, an eerie silence fell over the Blackthorn property, the kind of quiet that precedes either peace or total devastation. Standing Bear straightened his shoulders and walked toward the cellar door with the dignity of a man walking to his destiny. "Wait," Cordelia called out, her voice breaking. "There has to be another way." He turned back to her one final time, and the look in his dark eyes held all the love and regret of a man saying goodbye to his heart's desire. "There is another way," he said quietly, "but it requires something neither of us is ready for." "What do you mean?" Instead of answering, Standing Bear pushed open the cellar door and stepped into the pale morning light. Cordelia followed, her heart pounding as she saw the scene that awaited them. Ironclad sat on his war horse in the center of the yard, magnificent and terrible in his full ceremonial regalia. Behind him, 20 Lakota warriors sat motionless on their mounts, weapons ready but not raised, a show of force that spoke louder than any threat. But it was her father who captured Cordelia's attention. Thaddeus Blackthorn stood between the war chief and the ranch house, his rifle lowered but ready, his face set in lines of grim determination. He'd positioned himself as a human shield between Ironclad's warriors and his daughter, willing to die before he'd let harm come to her. When Ironclad saw his son emerge from the root cellar, something shifted in the war chief's granite expression. For just a moment, the mask of leadership slipped, and Cordelia caught a glimpse of a father's relief at seeing his child alive and unharmed. Standing Bear walked forward slowly, stopping halfway between his father's horse and where Cordelia stood. In that moment, he seemed to embody the impossible space between two worlds, no longer fully belonging to either, but somehow bridging both. "My father," he said in English, his words carrying clearly across the silent yard. "I am well. The Blackthorn family has treated me with honor." Ironclad's eyes moved from his son to Cordelia, and she felt the full weight of his assessment. Here was a man who'd spent his life reading enemies and allies, and she knew he was seeing far more than she was comfortable revealing. "The white woman bid for you at their slave market," Ironclad said, his English careful but clear. "Why would she do this?" Standing Bear was quiet for a long moment, and Cordelia held her breath, knowing that his answer would determine all their fates. When he spoke, his words were simple but filled with profound truth. "Because she sees with her heart instead of her eyes," he said. "Because she understands that courage and honor have no color, no tribe." Ironclad studied Cordelia for another long moment, then turned his attention to Thaddeus. "You paid $500 for my son," he said. "In my people's tradition, such a price creates obligation. Blood debt." "I don't want your debt," Thaddeus replied firmly. "I want peace between our peoples." "Peace?" Ironclad seemed to taste the word as if testing its flavor. "My son tells me you treat him with respect, that your daughter shows him kindness. This is unexpected." What happened next would be talked about around frontier campfires for generations to come. Ironclad dismounted from his horse and walked slowly toward Thaddeus, stopping just outside arm's reach. The two patriarchs faced each other, the cattle baron and the war chief, representing everything their peoples had been fighting over for decades. "Your daughter," Ironclad said quietly, "she has warrior's heart. My son sees this. I see this." He paused, his gaze moving to Standing Bear and then back to Thaddeus. "Sometimes the spirits send us gifts that look like curses. Sometimes they show us paths we did not expect to walk." Standing Bear stepped forward, understanding flickering in his dark eyes. "Father, there is a way. The old way from before the wars began." Ironclad nodded slowly, and Cordelia saw a hint of the wise leader who'd managed to keep his people alive through decades of conflict. "The joining path," he said, "two peoples becoming one through bonds stronger than blood." Cordelia's heart leaped as she began to understand what they were discussing. but her father's sharp intake of breath told her he understood the implications far better than she did. "You're talking about marriage," Thaddeus said bluntly, "between your son and my daughter." "I am talking about alliance," Ironclad corrected, "about showing both our peoples that there is another way forward, about turning a symbol of hatred into a bridge of hope." The silence that followed was heavy with possibility. Cordelia looked at Standing Bear and saw her own desperate hope reflected in his eyes. They'd found each other across an impossible divide, and now their fathers were offering them a chance to build something beautiful from the ashes of generations of conflict. But it would require courage of a different kind, the bravery to defy every convention of their respective worlds, to become pioneers in a territory where no maps existed. "It won't be easy," Thaddeus warned, his voice rough with emotion. "The territorial government, the other ranchers, hell, half the people in 3 counties will see this as betrayal. And my own people will call me traitor for joining with the horse soldier's family," Ironclad acknowledged. "But our children already carry pieces of both worlds in their hearts. Perhaps it is time for the worlds themselves to find each other." Standing Bear walked to Cordelia then, taking her hands in his as he had the night before, but this time in full view of both their fathers and the assembled warriors. The morning sun caught the gold in his dark eyes as he spoke words that would change everything. "My soul belongs to you, as I promised," he said softly, "but now I offer more than spirit. I offer a future where love writes the treaties, where understanding builds the bridges, and where 2 hearts brave enough to trust each other can show 2 nations the path to peace." Cordelia looked into the face of the man who'd awakened something in her she'd never known existed. Not just love, but purpose, not just passion, but the chance to be part of something larger than herself. "Yes," she whispered, the word carrying all the weight of destiny. "Yes." And as Ironclad and Thaddeus Blackthorn shook hands over their children's clasped fingers, sealing an alliance that would reshape the territory, Cordelia knew she'd found something worth every risk, every sacrifice, every moment of fear and uncertainty. She'd found her destiny in the eyes of a warrior who'd sworn his soul belonged to her forever. What did you think of this incredible love story that defied every odd and expectation? Have you ever felt that instant, soul-deep connection with someone that transcends all boundaries? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I love hearing your stories of love conquering impossible circumstances. And if tales like this one stir something wild in your heart, make sure to subscribe to Wild West Stories for more epic adventures of courage, romance, and the untamed frontier spirit. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that could change how you see love, destiny, and the power of 2 hearts brave enough to build bridges across any divide. Until our next frontier adventure, remember, the greatest love stories aren't the easy ones. They're the ones worth fighting for. Ride free, love fearlessly, and never let anyone tell you that some dreams are too big to chase.